Hey, welcome to the Tales of a Gearhead podcast. This is brought to you by Cornwell Tools. They're the choice of professionals since 1919. Yeah, 1919. A little bit of quick math work. That's over 100 years of building top quality tools. I'm your host, Stacey David. All right, let's turn the key and get rolling.
You know, whenever I'm out talking to other car guys, the subject always comes up about their shop and their dream shop and their man cave, you know, and the things that they're going to put together. It's funny because generally when you talk to these guys, right after that, they're like, well, I built my dream shop. And then I'm like, well, how is it? And they're like, well, it's too small. or they're like, well, I don't have enough electrical. Or, well, like, my codes is killing me. It's one of those things where it's almost like building a car. You have to really, if you're going to build a shop, or even if you're moving into an existing building, there's a lot of things to consider on how that shop is going to serve you. So let's talk about that a little bit. If you're getting ready to build a shop, first of all, you need to decide how much room you actually need. Not room to just store junk, but just how much actual working room do you need? And then, you know, if you want 2 lifts or what you're going to do, and then tack on at least another bay. You know, add up what you think you need and then add another bay. That's just a good rule of thumb. If you can add 2 more bays, do that too. Because generally, you know, people don't allow themselves enough room to really work on that. And that usually comes from somebody that hasn't really dug into a full-on build and realized how those things get strewn out all over the garage. That's one thing to look at. Another really important thing is your codes. You know, what are you going to have to do to get this thing to pass codes? Because, listen, I have been steered this way by well-meaning friends. For example, one of the first buildings that I built on a house that we had, you know, years ago, I just built a nice outbuilding. It was, you know, like a 40 by 60. And all my friends were like, yeah, man, you know, if you're X amount of distance from the property line and if the roof is only so tall, you know, you don't have to pull codes, you don't have to get a permit, you don't have to do anything. And I didn't know any better. And right in the middle of erecting this thing, there's a big stop order. And I ended up in front of the city council in downtown Nashville pleading my case that thought that I was trying to pull something over on the city. So, I mean, they sacked me with all kinds of fees and things I had to pay and apologies I had to do. It was a nasty thing, but it was a real lesson learning thing for me, that it's much easier to talk to the proper people first than to get caught doing something where they think you're a criminal, basically. Then when I went back to my friends that had told me this, they're like, hey, what happened? And I said, well, you know, the city made me pay all these fines. They're like, oh, man, I didn't know that. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I thought you knew all about this stuff. Oh, well, man, So I heard from another guy. It's like, oh, I get it. I'm getting the I heard it from another guy thing. That would be my first thing. Make sure you know your codes, just like we've talked about on the show. If you buy a car and you need to get some sort of title or paperwork on it, make sure you know what your local laws are. That's the first thing about any kind of a building. Then your electrical needs is probably the second biggest thing, even over plumbing. We'll get to plumbing in a second. But your electrical needs, what kind of tools are you going to bring in? Obviously, you need 110, and then you're going to need 220 if you're going to run a welder or any kind of a lift. And then you need to decide, do I need 220 single phase? Do I need 220 3-phase? Now, I know for a lot of you right now, you're going, what did he just say? Yeah, there's for you that don't know, there's single phase is what goes into most houses. A 3-phase is a much bigger load for if you're using a lot of electricity. So in the long run, if you're using a big 220 tool a lot, it's cheaper to go 3-phase. But if your building, your house, your neighborhood is not set up for 3-phase, then they have to bring it from wherever it's at. And in our situation, it's clear down the road at the interstate, so it's almost a mile away. So they would have to bring 3-phase power a mile to the tune of about $45,000. just to get three-phase to our house. If you have a bunch of three-phase tools that you bought at some yard sale because they were cheap, well, all of a sudden they're not so cheap. That's why it's really important before you go out and buy tools that you really are checking. And that's another thing. A lot of times at these sales, when these big machine shops are going out of business, almost all of their stuff is three-phase. And that's why it's really cheap, because people can't use it at their houses. I've had many friends, some of these old lathes and some of these Bridgeport machines, you can pick those things up for $200 or $300 now, but you can't use them if you don't have three-phase. So that's really important to be careful what you're buying, know what your needs are, and know how you're going to set up your shop. And then you also need to know how much service that you're going to have. For example, the current shop that we're just building, I had to bring 800 amps of service into that building. Yeah, 800 amps. Just because of some of the tools and the needs that I'm going to have there. That's a lot of power. And it was not cheap. But what you don't want to do is get in there and start turning your machines on and have circuit breakers going out and darkening your whole neighborhood and doing that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things to consider when you're building that man cave. Right down to how many electrical drops are you going to put in. Now, I know some of this stuff, you can't figure it all out because you add tools, you add other things. So you just want to try to give yourself, like on electrical drops and that kind of thing, where you think you're going to need some of this stuff and where your service is coming from. Okay, with that out of the way, now we're talking about things like plumbing. Are you going to have a sink there or not? And, how is that plumbing going to run out of the building? And what is it going to connect to? In other words, is it going to go to city water? Is it going to hook up to a septic tank? All that costs money. All that takes all kinds of permits to be pulled. So there's a lot of things to consider just to put a sink in, or even to run a hose to the outside. So, for example, if you were at a yard sale and you bought a nice pressure washer, and you're like, wow, that'll be really cool to have outside my shop. It's like, well, are you going to have the power to run the pressure washer, and are you going to have the water to run through the pressure washer? A lot of those are 220. And they require a certain amount of water pressure. That can turn into a very expensive pressure washer that you just got on sale. Keep in mind, as you're looking for these kind of things, what your needs are. What you don't want to do is get into a big thing where you're pulling permits all the time. Because one of the things we ran into is anytime you're running a big tool like a paint booth or something like that, wow, the laws and the certifications and things that go with something like that are completely different because there's, hazardous material waste and all that other stuff. Make sure you're researching what your man cave is going to be capable of. Then you need to talk about lifts. Most people build their shops to put some sort of a lift in there, and I really recommend having at least a 2-post lift in your shop. It makes life so much easier. And most of these are pretty affordable. At least they were until steel went so high, but they'll come back down. They do need to be wired up. They do need to be put a nice firm foundation. Now that is a big question. Most of your 2-post lifts require at least a 6-inch pad of concrete under them. And it depends on how heavy the lift is. Some of them require, 2 feet. To have the proper mounting on those 2-post lifts. Keep in mind, a 2-poster, if you get the car just a little off kilter, you got a lot of weight pulling that lift to fall. So not only is it important, obviously, that you center a vehicle on correctly, but man, you start picking the heavy stuff up, you better have the foundation or those things will go right through the floor. I've seen it happen. And guys will come in and they'll go, well, I think this was built with the right thickness of concrete. If you don't know for sure, there are companies out there that can come in and do kind of a seismic image of it, and you can tell exactly how thick that concrete is. And if it's not thick enough, you need to break it out, dig down, and put a footer in there. And obviously that's not cheap. Keep that in mind so you don't have your lift falling over on you, when you're working on it. That's really the main things, when you're that people don't look at it. I mean, they look at their walls and their doors and what kind of heat and all that stuff they're going to put in, but they don't look at these other issues. Man, once you spend a lot of money on your man cave or your dream shop or just your working garage, you want it to be a place that you enjoy working in and you can actually go out there and get stuff done. You're not chasing problems that you should have, dealt with when you were building it. So be careful out there and build yourself a cool shop, man. Get some work done.
I've got a quick question for you about this.
Yeah.
You get your shop built. You've kind of worked through a lot of this stuff. And like most people do, when they've built a shop that's bigger and can accommodate more projects, some people decided they want to learn different parts of the trade. So perhaps they start picking up welding. And now they're new to welding, so pretty much they're going to chase after probably like a MIG setup, let's say. For an enthusiast who is not a trained working welder, the $30 question here is, do you buy your own tank for gas, or do you go through someone and do their year-long lease program with the idea that you think you might do a lot of welding, but you may not touch that welder but twice every 6 months?
Yeah, really good question. If you're not going to be welding much, and you're just going to be an enthusiast out there, absolutely buy your own tank. Now, sometimes you have to really look because a lot of places won't sell you a tank. All they do is the trade-out deal. I recommend if you can buy your own tank and then just have them fill it when you need it, and you'll be better off in the long run.
When the subject of tools comes up in the shop, people will all talk about their sockets and their wrenches, but then we start to get into the subject of exotic tools. These are your body working tools, and these are your flangers and all these special tools. And people are like, where do you get those? Because you're not going to find those at Home Depot, and you're not going to find them at the local hardware store. And that is where Cornwell comes in. They have a catalog that's like the old phone books. You remember the phone books? Well, that's a Cornwell catalog. And these guys will bring the tools right to you. Once you start to get into that world, and once you start to see what's out there, you'll be like, what have I been doing messing around with the stuff that I find locally? One of the cool things about a company like Cornwell is that they do have warranties, and they have guys right on the trucks that can really talk to you about the tools and steer you in the right direction. So if you're really into your projects and you're into doing things right with good tools, check out Cornwell.
All right, I've got a question for you guys out there. What does November 11th, 1978 mean to you? Probably nothing, right? Well, it will here in just a minute. On November 11th, 1978, on the campus of Oxford College in Alabama, a film crew for a new television show called the Dukes of Hazzard filmed the famous General Lee jump, where it jumps over the patrol car in the opening credits, that jump. And the Dukes of Hazzard was born. That car was totaled in that jump. It gets one shot, and it totaled the car, which was kind of the harbinger of things to come, of what that show was going to be about. For those of you that are curious, the car reached 16 feet in the air, and it was an 82-foot long jump. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever spent any time in a 69 Charger. Those cars weren't exactly made to do that. And the fact that they actually did that with a pretty much a stock car is incredible. But if you'll watch that opening sequence as the car lands, you see that thing buckling all across the front. And they cut out pretty quick because the car's jumping away from you. But you see it buckling up there in front of the windshield. And they probably bent the car in half. Now, here's the cool part. That car in 2006... which was known as the Lee 1. It was the first General Lee that was put on camera. It was rescued from a junkyard in Alabama, and it was restored back to original condition, pre-jump condition, I'll clarify that. And it sold for $120,000 roughly at Barrett-Jackson in 2012. So that's pretty awesome that car was brought back to life, especially considering what had happened to it. I actually saw some of the restoration of it. It was a mess. I mean, they pretty much just started over with it. But who would have thought that car, that TV show would have become as influential as it was? I know that was coming right on the tail of Smokey and the Bandit. But when you think about it, that whole mentality of the car that did all these incredible things and never got a scratch on it, even though in the footage you could see the car getting destroyed, was just part of that late 70s, early 80s TV show era. And some of the best stunts, especially automotive stunts, that were ever put on camera to this day, because there was no CGI. These were real jumps with real stuntmen in them. And these cars, even like the Fall Guy truck, they weren't that heavily modified. And they were just kind of modifying them there on the set. For example, here's some of the stuff that they did. The cars got roll bars. Well, good, thank you. They had heavy-duty suspensions. They modified the brakes, and it says, they did other custom touches to make them show ready. And one of those was usually the jump cars had a load of concrete in the trunk to keep the cars from flipping over. Because, the magic of any car jump is you want the car to fly flat in the air. You don't want it to nose over, and you don't want it to tuck the tail under as it's flying. And so the only way really to do that back in those days was to jump the car and work on the ramp angle and the weight of the car to try to level it out. So they're destroying cars and tearing up stuntmen as they were trying to come up with this. Some of the jumps that they did with those cars and some of the stunts are just amazing. And he just became a cultural icon. So what an amazing thing. What an amazing time that was. I don't know, Jonathan, do you remember the first time you saw Dukes of Hazzard?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
What'd you think? Well, you're a kid. You're watching this show, and this orange car jumps through the air, and what happened? You were like, "Wow!"
I think I was about 7 or 8.
Yeah.
And number one, you never forgot how to slide across a hood like that.
Oh yeah.
And even when I was 15 or 16, when my buddies got their permits.
Yeah.
Everybody still tried to do the butt slide, and inevitably you would get caught about halfway across the hood, or you'd scratch it, or crease it, or
you'd catch the windshield wipers.
Oh my gosh. But number one, seeing all the dirt come flying off the rear of the car when it would jump, because you see that in that title sequence, and it's so cool. The one where they're like creek jumping, that was so cool. But the other thing was hearing Bo and Luke Duke do their yeehaw.
Oh yeah.
Like they had they had to give that yell.
Oh yeah.
And I have a twin brother, and we would mimic that when we would jump our dirt bikes. And we would try to do our yeehaw.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I think I was about 8, and you never thought the car ever got hurt. Those guys were just like, Cooter was always in the garage, and he was just like, no, we'll just fix anything. And you just assumed that they just fixed it every night. And it was perfect.
Which was great car culture. Kids growing up looking at that. And the Fall Guy truck was the same way. I remember watching that hit that first jump in that opening sequence, and you see that front axle just, taco. And the next scene, there it is, perfect. It's like, of course, it's a stuntman. He just got up and brushed it off. That was cool. I'm glad to see that people are watching these things. The acting is still as bad as it ever was, but you didn't really, watch it for that. And honestly, it's got kind of a charm to it that, is of the era.
So I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
And if you found that car, found that Lee one in the junkyard, and that it's all bent up from the front, that whole front clip area is just pushed up. Where do you go in and decide, okay, we're going to go from the middle of the frame forward, we're going to go from the firewall forward? How do you decide with something like that obviously huge impact?
Yeah, the biggest approach on that is you try to find where the damage is and try to find something that is not damaged. Usually, right through the firewall or the cowl, that's the strongest part of the car usually. So that generally is not destroyed. Everything forward of that's probably all bent up. But see, that can all be replaced. Now, if it is beat up through the firewall or into the cowl there, that all needs to come out. It's like taking the egg out of an eggshell, and that becomes a very tedious thing. That's when really you're looking at kind of a rebody kind of thing by utilizing just whatever of the original car and then building out around it. with new components. I know most of the parts for that car are available to the roof, whatever. But as I was watching, you don't see the full landing for a lot of reasons. The same reason you didn't see the landing of the Trans Am in Smoking the Bandit over the bridge, because the whole car buckled. But if it didn't buckle up through the roof, then, when you've got that passenger compartment, you can work out from there. I've seen some real historic vehicles, like some of these Ferrari racing vehicles that have been rolled and destroyed. Sometimes you just start with a piece. I think when I did Crazy Horse, the Bronco, the only part of that truck I didn't replace was the firewall. That was the only original piece, the firewall and the cowl right above it there with the windshield. And everything else was reproduction parts. So it's tedious. You better have it jigged up right. You go down the road really crooked. But a car like that with that kind of history, that's worthy of that kind of build. Now, the guy that sold that thing for $120,000, I guarantee you he had more work in it than that. To do a full-on build like that with that kind of body replacement stuff, that's a lot of metal work.
All right, that's it for today. Once again, we're brought to you by Cornwell Tools. Have a great day and get out there and work on something.